What happens when the quote-unquote knowledge class is alienated, or at least a sizable percentage of it? And by alienated means they don't get what they want. They were on this track to have social status and financial independence, and then it turned out they didn't have the skill sets for either. And now what do? Weaned on ideological identitarianism and converted into activists through their years in government schools. But then they come out and their services aren't in demand as they maybe thought. They're not going to be as handsomely compensated as they were told. I mean, unless they, get to work for one of those government-funded NGOs somehow. Although there's less of that, and there's less DEI programs too. So all of their, identitarian rhetoric gets bottled up with nowhere to go. This was the subject of this isn't his characterization exactly, it's mine. But it was the subject of a piece that we mentioned yesterday, or last week, I think, in the Journal, which I think is an important discussion because it has a lot of historical context and parallels. Not exactly, but as we discussed back then when we first took up this piece, reminiscent of the heady days of future academics at that point in time, Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers and others, to become the Weather Underground and engage in domestic acts of terror. Similar dynamic could take root in the U.S., writes the author of the piece in question. As the Trump administration downsizes public agencies, dismantles DEI programs, and slashes academic research funding, it risks producing a new class of people who are highly educated but institutionally excluded. History suggests this group may become a source of unrest and possibly violence. The elite overproduction theory is what this essentially is. More elite aspirants than there are roles to fill. Competition for status intensifies. People grow disillusioned. They take to politics, and in the politics of temper tantrum, which is the order of the day on the left in this country in particular, it could turn violent. It has. We saw it just the other weekend in Seattle, as I mentioned earlier in the program. Jukka Savolainen is a professor of sociology at Wayne State University. He's the author of the piece I referenced. He joins us now. Professor, thanks for being with us. Hope I didn't butcher your name.
That's quite all right, and thanks for having me. Thanks for your interest in my work.
Yes. So develop this a little bit more. The sort of elite overproduction theory and the indication that we're tracking in that direction, and what you see in terms of the probability of more incidents of violence.
Sure. Yeah. So I've had this overall thought, or I'm part of the, shall we say, the knowledge class. I'm a university professor. I've worked in public policy research as well. But as we probably all know, there's a very large higher education sector, and there's a fairly large public sector of federal workers in Department of Education, for example, that has an NSF that have been facing these cuts. And but for the longest time, being part of the this class of workers, I've asked myself a little bit about the why we have so many professors, why do so many kids go to college, and so on. And you may be familiar with the book, I think by David Horowitz from several years ago, he just passed away, called Tenured Radicals. It was a critique of what goes on in universities. So it's sort of, because in some ways, if you're a critic of higher education, like I tend to be, and kind of you might be as well, I've been wondering about what purpose does it serve? So one idea that I've had for a long time is that, well, one purpose that these tenured radicals are grading papers, and they are publishing papers in grievance studies, and it may not be so useful, but maybe there's a little bit of a purpose in that. At least they are teaching about radical ideas, but they're not engaged in that like some of them. Some of the identical folk were engaging in such in the U.S. as you mentioned, but especially I'm from Europe. I grew up in Europe in the 70s, and this was kind of an everyday occurrence: kidnapping, industrialists, bombing. Federal institutions and so on. So my purpose of my piece is to kind of like ring alarm bells. It's not something that's sort of likely to happen immediately, but if it becomes more of a permanent shift, we ought to be mindful of the fact that if you have disaffected, smart people, disconnected from institutions, kind of hopeless, these type of developments are entirely possible.
Well, right. I mean, look, I think there's a lot of relatively recent evidence to suggest this. I mean, from firebombing Tesla dealerships to taking over libraries. I mean, arrests have been made, and particularly with respect to the Free Palestine crowd. You know, when you're affiliated with more sophisticated operations than maybe you even realize, that link back to terrorist organizations, at least in funding. I mean, it doesn't take, it's not a long way to go from being adjacent to that to being a participant in that, even if you're not sort of as committed to the cause as those that are at the organizational level. I mean, this is what happens in these sorts of organizations. And by the way, we've seen this on the streets of Portland and Seattle over the last several years with Antifa, too. I'm not saying these are all Ivy League graduates, but they're not, all ghetto dwellers either.
Correct. Yeah, and so that's these are definitely indications that the sort of potential is the undergrowth is there. But what I would really be worried about is having a little bit more sophisticated, smarter, and organized type of almost terror cells, which they in reality were in Europe, in particular, of sort of elite educated folks. They might be targeting institutions like the Supreme Court this day and age, and so on. So these are the type of things that I'm concerned about. More systematic, organized, more sophisticated, and especially in this day and age with the access to technology and AI and that type of thing. So it's really kind of forward looking. Again, drawing from my own personal experiences and past. It's not just necessarily something that's happening right now, but as you suggested, there's definitely an undergrowth of something more significant evolving.
Well, the other thing, too, is it seems to me you have sort of two categories. You have the people that get involved in something that is organized, SJP chapters on campus and go from there. And then you have sort of, I'm thinking about like the radical Islamist terrorist attacks, you have the lone wolves that get radicalized online, or they're not affiliated with anything, but they take up the cause. It provides meaning in their life, and then they cross the line and they do something like, I don't know, plot the assassination of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, for example. So and those two profiles need to be treated a little bit differently, with the lone wolf being much more difficult to predict and interdict.
Yeah, absolutely. The things that are sort of missing. It was a coincidence that my piece came out at the same time, around the same time. I think it just preceded what happened in Washington D.C. with this the Jewish couple assassinated over there by a Palestinian activist, and then recently I just heard about the awful thing that happened in Boulder, Colorado. These are not these are awful incidents, obviously, and serious. But these are different from what I'm talking about in two ways. First of all, there's no indication that they are these are probably deranged radicals. Those not so much part of some well-organized, well-oiled terror cell or anything like that. Number one, and number two, they are simply targeting ordinary citizens who happen to be at the wrong, of course, the Boulder case was a recurring demonstration. They are not directly attacking sort of the institutions, or shall we say capitalism, or so on. So they are not focused on directly destroying institutions. And that's what was characteristic of the 70s radicalism by Weather Underground or the Red Army Brigade and so on in Europe.
Yeah, but part of it, too, is, I mean, this is not systemic, but it is indicative of a certain culture on campus. I mentioned the Weather Underground as you have, but just to be explicit about it. So Bill Ayers ends up being a tenured professor at University of Illinois, Chicago. Bernadine Dorn runs the Family Law Center at Northwestern University. Richard Kilgore, who is a former, James Kilgore, who was a former member of the Sudanese Liberation Army and was convicted and served prison times for his 1975 bank robbery. He winds up with a teaching position at the University of Illinois. When you have these, sort of political radicals who have a track record of violence and they wind up in academia,
they're celebrated.
That says something about it's not the sum total of it, but it says something about academia or a lot of academic institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that you mentioned that, I'm thinking about a little different, shall we say, theory or argument that's maybe best associated with Christopher Rufo and his argument about the long march through the institutions and these folks adding Angela Davis to the mix, for example. They have become mainstreamed in many ways in academia, and it's almost like that's kind of where my argument picks up, in a sense that they have been also in a way domesticated, shall we say. The radicalism has been domesticated, and like I said, it happens, not that it doesn't impact folks in teaching and so on. A lot of the wokeism comes from these circles, but at the same time, they have been contained. They have more to lose. These folks have, if they're older, they have their pension, their retirement accounts, and their tenured positions, and if you're a student, you aspire to those things. So the question is, do we want them to be, and it's a little bit of sarcastic, a little bit of flippant statement, but do you want them to be grading papers and teaching critical race theory in class, or do you want them to be throwing bombs and plotting a revolution out in the real world? Is kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, although I think there's a C choice of how about neither.
How about neither?
Yeah, that's probably the.
I'm not suggesting that we should sort of surrender and we shouldn't do anything about these ideological overreaches. But I guess it's more of a. I'm glad the journal published it. It's a little forward-looking kind of thing. Let me tell you an example of I talked to a gentleman recently whose nephew got laid off from the National Science Foundation. Okay, and that's. You don't want anyone to be, he was there for a long time, from what I understand. So it's, that's an upsetting circumstance, no matter what your job is. And so I was wondering how he's feeling about it. And what he did was, I would say, an ideal case. He reportedly, according to my friend, decided to go to trade school and become an engineer, electrician. And so that would be like I would say, you mentioned, how about neither? Wouldn't that be nice if many of these people started thinking about that instead of not that I don't know about he worked for the NSF, and I don't know exactly what he did there, but the point is that would be, I think, somehow an ideal if we could make this transition as we reform these institutions, streamline, reform, make them more accountable, but that we're able to direct a transition more and more these folks into more productive lines of business.
You mentioned Europe. The scenes in Paris over the weekend reminded me of scenes from the Battle of Algiers. What is your take on whether it's just, it's not necessarily limited to academia, but similar policies pursued well before the U.S. pursued them, and now those cultural and urban centers seem to be largely up for grab, or when they're not, they seem, up for grab seems to be bubbling just below the surface.
Yeah. So are you talking about? I'm actually in Europe right now, but are you talking about the riots that kind of coincided with the soccer?
Yes,
game,
exactly. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, France is of course kind of famous for. They're very eager to demonstrate and strike and that type of thing. But yeah, they obviously have a big problem with segregated cities and immigrant crime and so on. So what we have is that's why a lot of these so-called populist parties are taking hold, are becoming more and more popular. Americans like to look at the Trump situation, but there were similar type of movements, populist movements that have been happening all over Europe, even in Scandinavia, that are one of the most progressive countries. They have become, even in Denmark, where they have the Social Democratic Party has become anti-immigrant, which is very interesting. So the country and party that is Bernie Sanders' favorite party has become hardliner against immigrants, and they're trying to desegregate the cities and trying to assimilate folks. So those are interesting experiences, especially interesting examples, and for the American left to think about that the Scandinavian left is turning into approaching more of the Trump point of view on these issues.
And so the knowledge class, I mean, that really refers to sort of leftist academics versus versus the middle and upwardly mobile classes or groups. I hate class in America, but the working middle versus the leftist, the sort of coddled leftist elites in academia. This is what you're talking about, and if those leftist elites lose their perch, then they're prone, some of them, to instigate violence as the means to political ends.
I would say that if you think about it, it's a universal phenomenon. So I'm a professor of sociology who focuses on criminology and violence in particular, and the same thing applies to a lot of phenomena, like the cowboys of the Wild West, where disaffected, some of them were ex-Confederate soldiers, and there was a concentration of idle men hanging around, having free time around the saloons. We have the same issue in Southside Chicago. You have disconnected, unmarried, unemployed gangbangers in Chicago, right? And so on. You have that everywhere. In the Native American reservations, you have these chronically unemployed alcoholics who are fighting. And you think about the opioid epidemic. Much of it has to do with this. There's a term, deaths of despair, associated with that. These are from rural, gutted America, like West Virginia, where people have lost their jobs and income. But people respond in different ways. Okay, like some people. But
they don't get the institutional leverage that the leftist, the neo-Marxist activist gets from a mediating institution like academia. That seems to me the difference. I mean, you could say, I guess, that gangbangers get the leverage from criminal justice systems in Chicago that don't prosecute criminals, but that's a different sort of leverage.
What I'm trying to say, but let's put it this way. Let's just focus on the gangbangers and academics. The point is, if academics, they both want respect. That's often like the analysis about what happens in the inner city violence. It's about a respect and getting status. And if you take, the why you would maybe turn into, if you lose your status, if you are a frustrated former academic or a grad student who suddenly is looking at a zero job market with zero opportunities, then how do I get respect? How do I pursue something that is consistent with my identity as a respectable person? And in the inner city ghettos, that may be a crime and turf wars and whatnot. You create your own system of respectability, and that's what I'm saying. And this is what happened in the 70s. In the certain radical intellectual movements, it can be overthrowing, and this sort of political terror against institutions may be that source.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, it's interesting. Definitely an important sort of theoretical construct to consider in these times. We appreciate it. He is Professor Jukka Savolainen, Professor of Sociology at Wayne State University. Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
You're listening to Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
If you're an experienced homeowner who's outlived your assets or your spouse recently passed away, you need to call